So today, again, this is sort of like Scott mentioned, this is a two-part talk. Both of them are dealing generally with this idea of the value of apologetics or defending your faith. So the first one here, the one I'll give right now, will deal more with this sort of the biblical foundations for apologetics. And the second one will deal more with the practical usage and outworking of apologetics. So I want to make an assumption right up front here. I would assume that many of us, most of us, have dealt with bicycles in some way, shape, or form. Either we've ridden them, we've tried to ride them, we have kids that have rode them. You have some familiarity with bicycles. Now, interestingly, C.S. Lewis, you may be familiar with him. He's written all types of things like the Chronicles of Narnia or Mere Christianity. But he also has this bunch of shorter journalistic type essays. And it was really hard to find. I scoured the internet for about 2 months, and I could only find this one essay in a book called Present Concerns. It's on Amazon. And in this book, one of the essays he has is called Talking About Bicycles. And he takes us through these 4 stages of bicycles. So as I talk about these things, I want you to imagine in your own mind, in your own experience about these 4 stages. So these 4 stages are disenchantment, unenchantment, enchantment, disenchantment, and re-enchantment. So the first stage here, unenchantment. Now this will be sort of where my youngest daughter is at, Braylon. She's 1 year old. Okay, so she has a Radio Flyer bicycle in the basement. But she's really too young to ride it. We found a sale, so we got it quickly. So anyway, she's too young to ride it right now. But for her, when she goes downstairs and decides whatever toys she wants to bring upstairs for the day, this bicycle is really just another toy in a sea, and I do mean a sea of other toys in the basement. So she's rather unenchanted by the idea of riding a bicycle. But then you have the next stage, enchantment. Now maybe some of you remember this stage. This will be sort of where my 2 sons, Bryson, who's 3 years old, and Braden, who just turned 11 years old. You kind of see a B theme here, Bryson, Braden. Anyway, this will be sort of where they're at. They're at this enchanted stage. This is where you first learn to ride a bicycle. You feel so free riding it. You can soar down the concrete or down grassy knolls or up hills and all of these things. For me, growing up in Detroit, I grew up, maybe some of you are familiar with this area. I grew up around the I-94, Cashew, sort of Morass area. And so when I was in this stage of enchantment, I would ride my bike all the way down to Grosse Pointe, right down to the lake. Now, at this age, I get tired just thinking about riding my bike that far. But nevertheless, at that point, I was so enchanted with riding a bike. That's all that I could do. And then for many of us, we then go to this stage of disenchantment. Life really starts to happen. We get bills. We have children. You have all of these other things. You have jobs. You have all these other things that start to force you to reprioritize certain things in your life. And so for me, my bike got put into the garage and started to acquire cobwebs. So for many of us, we become sort of disenchanted with the idea of riding a bicycle. But then, as my oldest son, Braden, he started riding his bike, and he was sort of in that in-between stage where he could ride it down the street, but not all the way around the block or a couple streets over, those types of things. So I began riding my bike with him, and suddenly I was like, wow, I kind of missed this. So there was this re-enchantment that happened within me, and maybe that's with some of you as well. You put your bike down for a while, and you get to a point where you pick it back up. And so for many people, C.S. Lewis gives this example, because these 4 stages of life, although he compares and contrasts them with bicycles, this applies to many different areas of our life. Love, for example, we had instances where we were sort of unenchanted with the whole idea of love. Then we fell in love with someone, and then things happened. We became disenchanted with that love, and then next thing you know, we're re-enchanted by love again. This applies to so many different aspects of our life, and it also applies to spiritual aspects of our life. And for a lot of people, they're stuck in this third stage, this disenchanted stage. This is where people often wander from God for different reasons. And this is where apologetics comes in. See, Paul Gold, in his book, Cultural Apologetics, he gives us some ways of sort of characterizing or categorizing this disenchantment as it pertains to spiritual things. So think about these four things here. He says there's a felt absence of God in this stage of disenchantment. There's consumerism, this idea, us being rather consumed with materialism and things like that may push us away from this idea of God, blindness and foolishness, and finally idolatry. And I'll get more into that later. But these are sort of some things that categorize and characterize this stage of disenchantment. Think about, for example, what some atheists say. Even in their writings, they'll tell you how disenchanted they've become. Atheist Julian Barnes, he said, "I don't believe in God, but I miss him." I don't believe in God, but I miss him. Now, if you read the article in which he wrote this, it wasn't as if he was talking about, at one time I was someone that believed in God and I became disenchanted. That's not what he's saying. He's saying there that the allure, the idea, even the enchantment of the prospect of a God, I kind of miss that feeling, but I just don't believe. You see, here again is where apologetics comes in. Apologetics, and maybe you are familiar, but I'll just give a quick overview. Apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, and it means in defense of. And we see this replete all throughout the Bible. But one of the most well-known places where apologetics comes from is 1 Peter 3:15, which exhorts us to sanctify Christ as Lord in our hearts, always being ready, no matter the circumstances, no matter who you're talking to, wherever you're at, always be ready to give a reasoned defense for the hope that is within you, but to do it with gentleness and with respect. You see, apologetics isn't just about abstract truths. I get it. That's what a lot of people think. It's just these high sort of pie in the sky propositional truths that I don't want to be bothered with, a lot of philosophy and things like that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But it's not just about abstract truths, but also about concrete realities. See, apologetics in the Christian worldview is not just about truth, but as Dr. Peter Crave says, it's about truth, beauty, and goodness. Truth, beauty, and goodness, which has to do with reason, your conscience, and your imagination. Consider the words of the French philosopher Blaise Pascal. He says, make religion attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show them that it is. Show them that it is worthy of reverence because it really understands human nature, and attractive because it promises true good. Listen to what he's saying here. He's saying make religion, make your faith something that's attractive, that people desire to have, something what this atheist Julius Barnes talked about. He said, make them wish it were true. Oh man, this is such a wonderful story. If only it were true. And then he says, show them that it is actually true, because guess what? And I'm assuming all of us would believe this in here. It is actually true. This is where we move from disenchantment to re-enchantment. Now I get the typical view of apologetics. I hear it all the times. Oh man, this is for those nerds. Sorry, Scott, we're in the same boat here, brother. This is for those nerds, those guys and those women who love to read books that are no less than 350 pages. Who has the time to invest in all of that? Well, let me suggest to you that is sometimes one part. It's one part of apologetics for sure, for some people. But I want to suggest to you something different, something that's more befitting of our modern culture. An apologetic that isn't quite just head focused, but is also heart focused as well. See, apologetics is typically perceived as this method of removing obstacles from people's mind, removing these questions and claims and controversies from people's mind so that they can see Christianity and Christ and the Christian worldview for what it truly is, and then they can make a decision if they want to believe it or not. But we must also be able to move within a culture which is a melting pot. That is the United States. In fact, right here in Dearborn, think about all the different cultures that is right here. So we can't have sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to defending our faith. We have to be sort of malleable. And so in this way, apologetics is not only about giving reasons for the Christian faith, but it's also about giving reasons within various cultural frameworks. And this is exactly what Paul did. So if you have your Bibles, or if you have a device that has a Bible, or if you have tattoos that have Acts 17, please turn to that. I'm trying to cover all my bases. This is the 21st century, so I see some of everything. But if someone does have a tattoo of Acts 17, I would love to see that. Acts 17. So this is sort of the apologetics chapter. I mean, this is where people go to really understand and really see the practical outworking of apologetics, of defending one's faith. Here, the Apostle Paul goes to, we'll get into more detail here, but he goes to the Areopagus. He gives this wonderful speech in Athens. And again, this is the book in Acts chapter 17. And what he's doing here, I want you to think about this as we talk through this. He's building a bridge that on one side has disenchantment and unenchantment. And he's trying to build this bridge to re-enchantment. So in Acts chapter 17, and a little bit before it, Paul is going around with some of his companions, Silas and Timothy. And as they're going around, they're sort of going on this speaking tour around the Mediterranean. And they end up in this place called Thessalonica. And this is right in the beginning of Acts chapter 17, actually the first verse there. So when they're there, Paul, as was his custom, he reasoned from the scriptures. As it says in verse 2, then Paul, as his custom was, went into them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the scripture. Verse 3, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ. So here, and I want you to see, as Paul moves to different places, his strategies change. Remember how I just said that you have to be malleable. You can't have a one-size-sort-of-fits-all approach. And that involves really listening and understanding who you're speaking to. See, excuse me, he knew that in the synagogue, these were Jews. These were people who were familiar with the Old Testament, the only scripture that they had at that moment. So he's saying that, look at all of these different prophecies. Look at how it talks about this Messiah. This is who I came to talk to you about. This is who I come to preach and to proclaim to you. This is fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. This is what he's doing in Thessalonica. But as we see, as it goes on, some of them who heard him, some of them were persuaded. But there were others who weren't. And not only were they not persuaded, look at what happened here in verse 5. But the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason and sought to bring them out to the people. So there was persecution that began to happen. They were really upset with a lot of the things that Paul and perhaps Silas and Timothy were talking about. So as this persecution started, Paul had to flee. So they sent him to Athens. Now they sent him to Athens alone. So Timothy and Silas was not with him. So imagine Paul coming up to Athens. Athens. I imagine just saying that name, many of you have a picture in your mind. Perhaps you've read some tales that had to do with Athens and this incredible, illustrious city. Or perhaps you've watched a movie and had some pictures in your mind from these as well. But Athens was the birthplace in many ways of philosophy. You've heard, or perhaps you've read, Aristotle and Socrates and Plato's. These are people who come from Athens. And during this time, it was an incredible metropolis, replete with statues and monuments and artistry all over the place. This was a true renaissance of a place. But this was the classical period. And this was a little before the time of Paul. Sure, it was still a hub of philosophy and highly educated individuals. Again, it had incredible artistry. In fact, one historian, Pliny, said that when you arrived in Athens, there was this 40-foot tall statue of this Roman goddess called Minerva. And Minerva was the Roman goddess of wisdom and warfare. And everywhere, just imagine going around Dearborn, just as you see stoplights and stop signs everywhere, they said everywhere there were temples filled with idols of gods and goddesses. Another ancient writer said the Athenians surpassed all states in the attention which they paid to the worship of gods. This is how many, they surpassed every other place. This was how replete these idols were throughout the city of Athens. Now this stirred the heart of Paul. And we see this in verse 16. We're going to jump ahead here. It says, now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. He was incredibly upset to see all this going on. You see, he knew that instead of worshiping the true God, they adored lifeless idols. And he knew what this meant, that this meant futility. This meant utter hopelessness in reality. So his heart was stirred. So what are idols? What are idols in our modern day sense? Perhaps we don't have statues of gods or goddesses everywhere. But I wonder if there are other idols that many of us are distracted by. How about the idol of money? How many of us are more concerned about our financial state than anything else? How about comfort? Sex? How about phones? Especially these smartphones. They can do some of everything. How about our social status? How many likes and dislikes and retweets do we get on Facebook and Twitter and all these different social media platforms? So let me ask you a question. Are our hearts stirred by these idols of our time? You see, when Paul saw this, he knew the futility. He knew what this meant for them. But when we understand these things, are our hearts stirred in the same way to proclaim Christ? See, for him, that served as a catalyst for him wanting to talk to them about Christ. But does it do that within us? See, again, he knew futility, a twisted morality and ethics, and again, hopelessness was the fruit of worshiping these idols. Now, I asked a question here about are our hearts, something for us all and myself to contemplate. Are our hearts stirred by the idols of our time? But perhaps I should back up and ask another question. Are our hearts consumed by these idols themselves? Have we fallen prey to some of these idols in our lives? And do we need to reorient our hearts and our affections towards the ones of Christ? Now let's jump to verse 17 and 18 here. Here we're going to see that Paul is starting to encounter some specific groups of people. In verse 17 it says, therefore he reasoned in the synagogue, similar to what he did in Thessalonica with the Jews and with the Gentile worshipers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. Verse 18, then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, what does this babbler want to say? And others talked about how he might be proclaiming or worshiping some false and foreign gods. Now this is interesting. You see, he's addressing, as I said, the people in the synagogues and in the marketplace. But then they identify the two most well-known and appreciated groups of philosophers at that time, particularly in Athens, the Stoic and the Epicureans. You see, the Epicureans were this upper class of philosophers. They were materialist and sort of pantheistic, meaning that they believed that sort of everything was materialistic, everything was God, and they didn't necessarily deny the existence of the Greek gods, so like Minerva, perhaps Zeus, and these things. They didn't deny the existence of them, but they felt like these gods were aloof from humankind. They didn't really care about what was going on with humankind. So this, in our modern day, this would be the idea of deism, okay? That God sort of spun the world into existence and then kind of went off and did his own thing. It has nothing to do with humankind as it pertains to today. And then you have the Stoics. Now the Stoics were around about 300 years before Christ. So they go back really far. And they denied the existence of a transcendent God. Excuse me, the Stoics were the pantheists, not the Epicureans. And so they believed that reason pours forth from the universe, and that reason should be the compass for our lives. One other thing that I should have mentioned with the Epicureans, just as the Stoics believed that reason should be the compass of our lives, the Epicureans believed in sort of hedonism, that wants to seek pleasure above everything else. So you have one seeking pleasure as the compass of one's life, and the other seeking simply reason as the compass for one's life. And this has me thinking a little bit about this, these two terms, faith and reason, particularly as it pertains to Christianity. A lot of people are so confused by these two terms, but these are not mutually exclusive terms. You see, in Christianity, faith and reason actually have a symbiotic relationship. You see, faith in Jesus, faith or some would construe it as trust or allegiance. Faith in Jesus Christ serves as the foundation for Christianity, and reason is the roadmap for the mind. Faith is the foundation. Faith in Jesus Christ serves as the foundation for Christianity, and reason serves as the roadmap for the mind. And so these folks begin to inquire, these Stoics, these Epicureans, these Jews and Gentiles begin to inquire about this new teaching that Paul had, that he was telling them. And so they took him to what was called the Areopagus. Now the Areopagus is two Greek words, eros and pagos. And these two words mean the hill of Ares. And maybe you recognize that word, Ares. That's the Greek god of war. So again, you see this continued theme of idolatry in Athens. Now the Areopagus consisted of the aristocrats. This was the city council. They comprised about 100 people, and they were the leading court. They controlled the visiting lecturers. They determined who would speak, and they investigated foreign cults. So much so that this was the court that ruled and made sure that Socrates was actually executed, because they believed that he was promoting false gods. Now, we have no reason to believe from the text that Paul was necessarily in danger of death by going to speak to the Areopagus, but it is important to understand that these are some of the things that characterize the Areopagus. So here is where Paul gives his famous speech. And you'll notice here in verse 22, the first thing he does is he builds this bridge that we talked about before. He builds a bridge actually in the conversation. And I think that this is instructive for us as we enter into conversation or dialogue with people, particularly on questions or claims or things that may be utterly abhorrent to us. If you want to reach the person, oftentimes you have to build a bridge in the conversation. Here's what he says in verse 22. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious." Now, some people say this could have been sort of a passive-aggressive comment by Paul. This could have been like a backhanded compliment, like, oh, wow, look at all these idols and statues everywhere. Yeah, you're very religious. But a lot of people, a lot of scholars actually say that, no, this was actually a positive compliment from him, because again, he was trying to build a bridge in the conversation. So he was saying, hey, I see that you are very devout individuals. And again, this is key for us, particularly in apologetics. But again, so then we start to see the other side of the bridge in verse 23. He says, for as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. Now, according to Athenian tradition, some 500 years ago, there was this incredible and devastating plague that actually wiped out a third of the population. And so the people of the town, remember, they had gods and goddesses, idols everywhere. They started sacrificing to each and every one of all of these gods and goddesses. But the plague didn't stop. People continued to die. And so there's this one Greek philosopher, Epimenides, and he suggested, he said, hey, maybe we have to identify a God that, or maybe we have to sacrifice to a God that we haven't identified yet. We don't know the name of this God or goddess. So let's make a shrine or a statue to this unknown God. Just leave it as unknown, and let's sacrifice to that God. And so that's how we got that statue there. So again, this was ultimately a show of reverence to some God that had not been previously identified. And so this is the God that Paul would soon reveal to them. Now, I won't read, for time's sake, verses 24 through 28 here, but just if you get some time, read over it. Essentially what Paul is doing here, he starts to give an overview of biblical theology and the Christian worldview, oftentimes in direct opposition to the beliefs of the philosophers. But in verse 28, Paul explicitly quotes a pagan philosopher. Here he says, for in him we live and move and have our being. As also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Now here we find that these lines, again, by the philosopher I just mentioned, Epimenides, and another poet of that time, Aratus. These are lines that were actually meant for the Greek god Zeus. So what did Paul do? Why would he use these things? He appropriated some of their language and some of the dialogue that they had and said, listen, because you have to remember, all truth is God's truth. All truth is God's truth. So he's saying this, yeah, what they're saying here is true, but it's pointed in the wrong direction. Let me point it in the right direction, and let me point you to Christ. And that's what he was doing. So some may say that his referencing of a pagan philosopher was strange. But in this way, we have to remember that this is a way to bridge the chasm of understanding. You see a lot of people doing this. They'll use media, they'll use movies and music and fiction books to all as ways to talk about Christianity and help to bridge that the chasm in these conversations. So Paul goes on to continue his descriptions, and he ends with God judging the world through one man, whom he provided proof for by raising him from the dead. Now this was scandalous to the ears of the Greeks, who lacked belief in any kind of physical resurrection. But the text does go on to say that ultimately some believed, and it actually names a man and a woman who believed. Now, some say that Paul was unsuccessful because he didn't get a big group of people to believe, or maybe that because he didn't explicitly mention Christ here, that he regretted the way he went about it, and that he was engaging in too much philosophy. We have to remember a couple things. Number one, these are snapshots of conversations and speeches and things like that. So there's a chance he could have mentioned Christ. Perhaps he didn't. I'll talk about this more in the second talk, But sometimes in conversation, you have to get people to the point. For an atheist, for example, you oftentimes won't jump straight to Christ. If they don't believe in God, they won't believe in Christ in the first place. So you have to work with them to understand that understanding that God, a divine being, is necessary for our world and for certain other aspects of belief. So that's sort of what Paul was doing. So here again, Acts 17 sort of serves as Paul's apologetic tour de force. Now this wasn't necessarily a parallel example to what many of us will encounter. I don't suspect that many of you will have to stand in front of 100 philosophers or something like that and give a treatise on biblical theology and Christianity. But hopefully you can glean some understanding of how to go about these things from what Paul has done in this case. You see, Paul sought to enchant his crowd by telling them the story that undergirds the hope that he has. And along the way, he dealt with some of their preconceived notions. Hear these words by atheist Luke Ferry. I find the Christian proposition infinitely more tempting, except for the fact that I do not believe it. But were it to be true, I would certainly be a taker. Were it to be true, I would certainly be a taker. Sometimes it takes us, as I get it, it can be frightening. It can be hard to get into these conversations where you don't know what people is going to ask. Trust me, I understand that. I get it all the time. But sometimes it takes us being willing to be used as vessels of God, for us to be used to explain that the desire that people have, the enchantment, the allure of the Christian story is not a desire that's misplaced, but that their desire is actually a true one. So in closing, let me ask you this. Where is your Athens? Where is the place that perhaps God is telling you that you should be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within you? Where's that place? Perhaps it's when you walk out here and you encounter someone at the grocery store. Perhaps it's your next door neighbor. Perhaps, I know with COVID, a lot of us are working from home, but some of us have gone back to our physical buildings. Perhaps it's with a coworker. Where is your Athens? Where is the place that God would have you to go and be a vessel for him? Remember, no matter what, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that is within you, but to do it with gentleness and respect. Thank you. Are there any questions or things that someone might state? Yes, sir. And if you could, please say your name for me.
Hi, my name's Wayne.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Wayne. Scott, I thought we talked about the first question was going to be an easy one, like how do you spell Bible or something like that.
Wayne did not get the memo.
He didn't get the memo. Okay. No, seriously, thank you, Wayne. Thank you so much for that question. I mean, it is such an important one, and it's a very relevant one, as you pointed out. And I would assume that many of us probably have wrestled with these things, perhaps in private conversations, social media. Hopefully, not too many social media conversations that could go down a bad angle there. I'll just give a couple principles to perhaps consider. The first thing I would say is that, first of all, like I said before, we have to be malleable in our presentations and the way that we talk about these things. So it does depend a lot on who you're speaking to. If you're speaking to another Christian, it might be one way. If you're speaking to a non-believer, it could be a totally different way. Let's say you're speaking to a non-believer who's incensed at a lot of the unrest. And I won't go into picking sides or anything like that, but I'm just going to talk about it sort of generally here. But let's say you're talking to an atheist who's, like I said, uncomfortable and incensed by, or let's say this person is an advocate for justice and things like that on whatever realm you might say. And you can build a bridge in the conversation and say, I agree with you. Justice is a beautiful thing. It's something that we all should desire. But on an atheistic worldview, where do you even get the grounding to for justice or for judging something as morally right and morally wrong? You see, there's no objective standard on atheism, because atheism assumes a reality that's subjective and relative. So at that point, if our universe is one that came together by chance, by happenstance, if we are just a collocation of molecules and a result of evolution, but there was no guided force, there was nothing that intimately created us, then how can you have sort of a reference point for judging something as good and evil? It's only up to your own standard. So if you say that justice is a good thing as an atheist on an atheist worldview, and another atheist over here says, well, I think that justice or injustice is a good thing. Well, who do you say is right? What is the objective standard under atheism? There is no objective standard. The standard is based on one's personal feelings and one's personal whims. So at that point, might is what will characterize it. And we saw that, for example, with the Holocaust. It wasn't that it was ever a good thing, but Hitler and the Nazi regime had the might, they had the power. So their morality is what became the standard. So I'm not saying that atheism, I want to be clear here, I'm not saying that atheism necessarily leads to something as atrocious as the Holocaust or antebellum slavery or any of these other historical atrocities. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is, on an atheistic worldview, there is no objective standards with which to adjudicate moral values and duties. Something that's good and something that's bad, something that's right and something that's wrong. It's only dependent upon the person. So that's how I would sort of engage with someone, and then I would sort of build a bridge. But in Christianity, we serve a God. We serve a God that in Isaiah chapter 61, I believe it's verse 8, he says, For I, the Lord, loves justice. In Psalm 89:14, we serve a God that says that the very foundation of his throne, the pillars of his throne, was built on these two virtues of justice and righteousness. You see, justice and righteousness are virtues that flow from the very being of the God that we serve. So we have an objective reference point for saying these things. So anyway, that's sort of how I would engage with a non-believer. With a Christian, this could get a bit more sticky, because I get it. There are sometimes, dependent upon one's political affiliations and things like that, one may perceive things a bit different, okay? And I won't get into the difference in politics. That's not what I do up here. But I will say, in conversations with Christians, I would say just try your best to think about these things from a biblical worldview. It's hard. If I can be honest, all of us have blind spots in some ways. A lot of cultures, you have blind spots, okay? If you talk to Christians from other faiths and ask them ask them how they would perceive something like the parable of the lost son or the parable of the lost coin, I guarantee you'll glean understandings that you never had before. Why? Because they're coming from a different cultural reference. And that's what's so beautiful, I'll say, about the body of Christ in general, is that it's comprised of so many different cultures and so many different peoples, so many different racial and ethnic groups, that we can come to understand God better from our sort of multi-ethnic mosaic family. But back to your question specifically, with Christians, I would just try my best to focus on the Bible, how we should perceive these things, and try and filter them through the two greatest commands that God gave, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. I do want to say one more thing real quick, and I think you had your hand up, so I'll come to you in 1 second here. COVID-19, forgive me, I skipped over that. COVID-19, RZIM has done talks on COVID-19, Q&As on COVID-19. So if anyone wants to hear this subject talked about from a lot of different angles and perspectives, if you just type in like COVID-19 and RZIM, you'll get a whole list of stuff, information to chew on. One thing I'll say is that COVID-19 has brought so much uncertainty, so much unrest, so many differences of opinions and how we should even engage with this virus, okay? What I can say is that as a Christian, no matter what storms come, no matter what uncertainties may get brought up, Christ, as Marcus sung about earlier, is the cornerstone. He is the anchor for our souls, as it talks about in Hebrews. So even though these things happen, and perhaps some of you have lost loved ones, perhaps you've had loved ones who've been affected in different ways, maybe not physically, maybe their jobs or things like that. So there's depression, there's all these things going on. The God of the Bible cares about these things. He loves you, and he intimately understands what you've gone through because he intimately engaged and interacted with suffering himself. If you think about it, again, the shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept. So he cares about all the emotional things that we deal with, but even through all those things, our hope, no matter what, is undergirds our faith. So that's just a couple of things I want to say about COVID-19. But again, if you want to see this explored from different angles, RZIM has done a number of Q&As and things on it. So.
From you being an individual that's being reliant upon God, and as you know, Paul talked about him not relying upon wise words. How would you respond to that?
Oh, that's a good word, Tyra. You can come up here and get the next talk. No, thank you. Thank you for that question. I'll repeat it. Hopefully, I'll get the essence of it. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So essentially, what Tyron was asking there, he was saying, how do you talk to people, particularly within the church, who have this view of apologetics where it's something that like people that you have to be like really smart or have eloquent words or eloquent speech to engage people, and that apologetics is oftenly more reliant on the on these elements of philosophy and reason and logic than actually reliant on the power of the Holy Spirit. Is that the essence of the question? Okay. Great question. What I would say is, come to my second talk at 10:30, and I'll explore these things in more detail. No, seriously. I am going to talk about these things. Really, that's a great question that leads into my second talk here. But I would say this. Apologetics is woven into evangelism. If you ever talk to someone about your faith, then you're giving a reason, okay? So many of you you probably look at me as an apologist or Scott as an apologist because I do this for my vocation. But if any of you have engaged someone and defended your faith in any way, and I'll actually talk about different ways in which you can defend your faith in this second talk. But if you've done that, guess what? You've done apologetics. You've been an apologist. And if you've been engaging in evangelism and talking to people about Christianity, about the truth of who Christ is, about the truth, the beauty, the goodness of the Christian worldview, then you've done evangelism. Now, no matter what, as Tyron pointed out here, all of this should be undergirded by the power of the Holy Spirit. Oftentimes, when I'm asked a question, and sometimes I get ones where I just have to say, hey, I don't know. I haven't researched that. I can tell you this, but I haven't researched that. Oftentimes, when I get questions, when Wayne was giving me his questions, sometimes I'll pray in the back of my mind real quick. God, help me to give an answer that touches Wayne here and some others in the audience. I try I don't do it before every question, but I try my best to rely on the power of the Holy Spirit, because we know that is where our wisdom and things like that truly derives from. And guess what? You know the beautiful thing about apologetics? A lot of people, and I did as well, particularly when I first got started in apologetics, we get nervous and we feel like we have to be the ones to convert someone. Guess what? You can take that burden off. As Greg Kokel of the ministry Stand to Reason says, what he tries to do oftentimes, his goal is to put a stone into someone's shoe. Gives them some nuggets of information to chew on. Think about, perhaps, I don't know all the conversion stories of everyone in here, but I imagine that perhaps there were some people who didn't believe at one point and came to believe. Or perhaps you believe in a different worldview and now you're a Christian. Or perhaps you're sitting out there and you're just trying to glean some information today. Your conversion likely didn't happen from one person saying one thing. It happened over time, over thinking through different things, over gleaning different information, over different experiences, over different narratives that you've received that have been meshed with the truth. So I would say that don't let apologetics be something, and when you see some of the more professional apologists, William Lane Craig, our beloved and now deceased Ravi Zacharias, so many of these apologetics giants in a way, Mary Jo Sharp, Dr. Joe Vitale, these incredible women of the faith, excuse me, don't let, because they've studied these things, don't let that be a hindrance to you going and learning some things and also engaging people. God will meet you where you're at, and they'll meet people where they're at. And again, in my second talk, I'm going to give different ways of going about apologetics. Because as I thought about that second talk, I said, okay, I'm going to be here, and I'm assuming there's people of different personalities, different comforts. So I want everyone to leave here feeling like you can do this wherever you might be like, so wherever you may be at. So again, if you're able to, stay for that second talk, and hopefully you'll get something from that. So thanks again, Tyra, and I'll go into more detail with that later. Sir in the back with the red shirt, I think he had his, oh no, excuse me. No, I'm sorry, you had your hand up first, sorry.
I've had some conversations with some people who are either so bitter at God in general or Christianity in particular that they're like, well, even if God or Christianity is true, I don't want to believe it because they're so awful. How would you respond to someone like that? Because oftentimes it's kind of been like, well, I can't help you. Like, do you have any, what would you say to someone who says that?
And your name was David?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, David. And can you clarify one thing for me? You said that they're so awful. Are you saying that they're so awful as in like God or Christ, or are you saying Christians?
Yeah. They'll say God is so awful, the God of the Bible, that even if he were true, I wouldn't want to believe in him. And I'm like, well, that's no good for me to prove that he's real then. Like, you've already, like, I don't know where to go from there.
Yeah, great question, David. So the first thing I would do is, and I would suggest to get a book called Tactics. I mentioned Greg Kokel earlier. A couple of people are shaking their heads, so they're familiar with this book. Get a book called Tactics by Greg Kokel. He lays out the ways in which you can engage in these conversations. So he has this tactic called the Columbo Tactic. Now we have some young folks in here, but we have some folks who may have me by a couple years as well. So, so maybe you're familiar with this detective Columbo, right? I have to admit, I didn't know who Columbo was until I read the book, and then I went and watched some TV shows. Columbo was this detective, right? And he kind of acted like a bumbling, fumbling kind of guy. Like, he really didn't know, a whole lot. But it was all part of his sort of stick. And he would ask a lot of questions. And that's how he would really get to the root of the question, or to the root of the individual. And so Greg Kokel, in his book, he talks about using the Columbo tactic of asking questions. Although he talks about it in a Columbo sense, really Jesus did this many years before Columbo did. If you look at the interactions that Jesus had with Pharisees and Sadducees and other individuals, he would always be asking them questions to draw out what's really there. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 6, this verse says, always be, to let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, always being ready to give an answer to every person who asks. Not every question, not answer every question, not answer every claim, but to answer every person. So the important point of that is that we want to be person focused, okay? So that often means that a question often serves as a veil for what's really the underlying issue. So questions will actually help to draw out what's the issue. So David, if someone were to ask me that, I would say, well, in what ways do you find God to be abhorrent? In what ways do you find that you just, even if Christianity were true, if it were to be proven true, why wouldn't you be a Christian? So I would try and draw out some more responses. Now you might get something like, well, some people have had personal experiences with Christians themselves. And I'll talk about that a little bit in my next talk as well. So that may serve as the root of some of their bitterness. Perhaps there will be other apologetics claims like, wow, do you see God, as Scott mentioned when he was reading my bio, a question that I deal with all the time is slavery in the Bible. Wow, well, God seems to condone slavery. You see it throughout the Old Testament. You see Paul talk about it in the New Testament. Why in the world would I want to serve a God who seems to condone slavery? Or you have someone that might say, if you think about in the Old Testament, the slaughter of the Canaanites, why would God say, go kill these men, these women, these children, the animals? Why would you even want to serve a God like that? Or perhaps they'll even say something like, I see an inconsistency with this God, so this God can't be true. How can this God say that he's a loving and an all-loving God, but also be a promotion of such evils as the ones that I mentioned? So David, what I would do, again, I would ask questions, try and draw these things out. And then that'll give you some particulars with which you can deal with. And you know what? It's okay to say in some of these references, if you're not familiar with the whole narrative of the Canaanites and things like that, or you're not familiar with many of the biblical passages that discuss slavery and things like that, it's okay to say, hey, that's a great question. Let me look into that some, and I'll get back to you. But actually get back to them. That's the beautiful thing. And you'll be surprised at how many people respect the fact that you took the time to look into it and get back to it. I'll say this last thing in closing. Earlier, I mentioned Abdul Murray, a friend and a colleague, Senior Vice President of RZIM. He spoke at some of the conferences that I believe. So I actually think that he spoke with Pastor Jeff too at some conferences, I believe, in the past. Part of his conversion story from Islam to Christianity dealt with the fact that he had people in his life, one of his great friends, Mickey Badalamenti, and a New Testament, a person who's now a New Testament scholar, Dr. Michael Licona, who's written a lot on the resurrection of Jesus. These individuals at a young age constantly talked with Abdu about these different questions and claims and things like that he had about the Christian faith. So they walked through them with him. And oftentimes that meant they had to go do some research and then come back to him. And now, I mean, Abdu is someone who's just, a giant in the, literally because he's like 6'8", but he's a giant in the apologetics field, and someone who, I've gleaned a lot of wonderful information and perspective from. So I just say that don't be intimidated if you receive questions, and this is for everyone, that may be a bit too, that may be something that you're not familiar with. Take the time, research it, but really, really get back to that individual. And you'll have an opportunity to build a relationship and perhaps help lead this person from disenchantment and unenchantment to enchantment. So thank you again for that question, David. Joe, thank you, because you're also a perfect lead into my second talk here. It's almost like I planted you and Tyron here with these questions. No, but seriously, that's a great comment. And I'm going to get into that in the third section of my next talk. That apologetics is not just about the communication, but it's also about the demonstration of your faith in word and deed. So thank you so much for coming out early in the morning, and I hope if you're able to stay for the second session there. God bless.